Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national broadcaster, about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and India's involvement in a variety of global groupings that help to bring about international prosperity and security. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up the theme of the BRICS grouping: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, its expansion, the implications of its expansion, and also the future of the BRICS grouping, where India has played a prominent role. And to discuss this, let me introduce you to a very esteemed guest who has joined me in the studio, Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharyya. Ambassador Bhattacharyya was India's BRICS sherpa for 2 years when Russia was holding the presidency, and then when India was holding the presidency of BRICS. And he has been India's ambassador to a number of countries: Turkey, Egypt, Switzerland. He was secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs and distinguished former diplomat. Welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Ambassador Bhattacharyya, BRICS, 15th summit of BRICS in Johannesburg, South Africa, had a momentous decision, which is to expand the membership. It initially started off as BRIC 2005-2006, then became BRICS 2010 with the inclusion of South Africa, and now 6 new members have been added on, and so it's going to become BRICS plus 6 more. There's a total of 11 countries in this grouping of large developing countries, emerging market economies as they've been called. And you have closely worked in the BRICS diplomatic processes for the Indian government and have seen it at close quarters. So I'd like your first reaction on this big change that has been announced after the Johannesburg summit. What do you think about the expansion, the members that have come in, and what it's going to do to this institution that began with a lot of promise but has run into quite a bit of rough weather in the recent years?
Well, let's put the context for BRICS. BRICS is one of the very few institutions which came up in the 21st century. As the 21st century, it reflected the contemporary realities of geoeconomics and geopolitics to a large extent. And the first expansion was a response to reflecting it even better. So BRICS has always sought to be a grouping for emerging economies, large emerging economies, which work not only for themselves, but also have a representative role for the community of other countries around them, developing countries. You would recall that after that inclusion of South Africa, we decided to have the new development bank, or the BRICS Bank. And it started with the 5 original countries. But during our presidency, the decision was taken to adopt criteria and processes for the admission of new members of the NDB. So admission of new members to the BRICS process is not a new idea. But I think what is important to recognize is that it is done in a very systematic manner. And India has been very crucial and key in this, in ensuring that the organization moves as one through consensus, through the adoption of established criteria and procedures. This particular one, as you know, the Sherpas had been tasked to prepare a concept note, which they did through a lot of effort, and they presented it to the foreign ministers who had met a couple of months ago. And then that was discussed further, and I'm so happy that it was adopted at the summit, and 6 new members have been brought in. In some ways, the 6 new members reflect what BRICS wishes to do. For long, we had seen that Africa, which is actually the continent of the future, the continent of greatest promise, had been neglected by the development processes that were going around globally. And so I'm very happy that in the 6 that we have added this time, there are 2 from Africa, and very prominent ones,
Ethiopia and Egypt.
Ethiopia, both very, very close partners.
And these are major regional leaders also.
Absolutely. Ethiopia is the seat of the African Union. It's of course a very ancient civilization. Egypt is our strategic partner, so we are very, very happy. When we move to the Arab world and the Gulf, where energy security is a major item for the global community, we are very happy that the admission of again two of our strategic partners, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, has taken place. Iran will bring that huge balance, and it shows also that the new rapprochement that is coming about in the region is being recognized by the community of the global south. And in the same manner, the admission of Argentina is also very relevant to add to the weight of Brazil in the South American continent. So overall, I think it's a very positive first step. But also remember, Sreeram, that what the BRICS leaders have done is to add a para in their joint declaration, which says that they're also looking at partner countries.
Beyond the full members.
Beyond the full members.
Yeah.
And so that puts this levels of membership and participation, which will truly make this a much broader organization. As Prime Minister said, it'll make BRICS more strong, and it'll become give new impetus to the movement.
Ambassador Bhattacharya, there has been some commentary I've read in the Western media saying that, you know, the expansion of BRICS is a victory for China, and that essentially they are the ones who are going to benefit the most from it, and because they want to create this big coalition of several developing countries like a bloc to challenge the US and, you know, as part of the new Cold War and all that. But I think it's much more nuanced, isn't it? I mean, when looking at it from an Indian point of view, we have solid relations, major strategic partnerships with 5 out of the 6 countries, and Ethiopia is almost like a strategic partner, even though it's not formally so. And some of these members are actually former US allies as well, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, major recipients of US military assistance and all that, right? So it's, I think, much more nuanced, isn't it? And the perception that somehow the Chinese or the Russians somehow won and that India lost, I think it's completely wrong, the way it's been portrayed. So your thoughts on the geopolitical backdrop and the jockeying for the expansion, what do you think about that?
Dr. Chaulia, I agree with you. I don't think this is a question. There are certain sections of the media, both in the West as well as in certain other parts of Asia as well, which have tried to project this in that context that you referred. But BRICS is not aimed at any other country or at any group of countries or a Western bloc or whatever it is. BRICS is, in some ways, it's the global south. But I think essentially it is emerging economies which are focused on cooperation within themselves, expanding that cooperation to other countries, consolidating their efforts, and then finally trying to bring about change in global governance through consensus. If you look at this, and I think you pointed out very accurately, that many of these countries that have joined are extremely very close to the Western countries as well.
Yeah.
India has always had a policy which has not aligned itself with any bloc, and it continues to maintain that autonomy in its policy making and its strategic decisions, and it will continue to do so. And I think in many ways the BRICS sees India as that institution, that country, that civilization that provides values and principles, a certain solidity which they all treasure. Also, if you look at the way, we can later discuss the way the statement has come out, many of these things become more apparent. So this story or this narrative that certain countries are trying to capture it for their own goal will not happen, because when major countries like India do not subscribe to it, it cannot happen.
We won't let it happen. So viewers, in fact, the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, in fact mentioned that earlier it was like a club of 5 countries, and now we want to make it a genuine multilateral institution. And he has also said, echoing Ambassador Bhattacharya, that the BRICS Plus, the expanded, is not in competition with the G7, which is the group of advanced countries. It's got a different set of logic and purpose to it. Let's hear from none other than Prime Minister Narendra Modi, viewers, now about the expansion and India's position on the expansion and how we have facilitated the expansion of BRICS. Let's hear the Prime Minister and continue the discussion.
भारत ने ब्रिक्स की सदस्यता में विस्तार का हमेशा से पूरी तरह समर्थन किया है। भारत का ये मत रहा है कि नए सदस्यों के जुड़ने से ब्रिक्स एक संगठन के रूप में मजबूत तथा हमारे सभी साझा प्रयासों को एक नया बल देने वाला होगा। इस कदम से विश्व के अनेक देशों का मल्टीपोलर वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर में विश्वास और सुदृढ़ होगा। मुझे खुशी है कि हमारी टीम्स ने मिलकर एक्सपांशन के गाइडिंग प्रिंसिपल्स, स्टैंडर्ड्स, क्राइटेरिया और प्रोसीड्यूर पर सहमति बनाई है और इनके आधार पर आज हम अर्जेंटीना, इजिप्ट, ईरान, सऊदी अरब, इथियोपिया और यूएई का ब्रिक्स में स्वागत करने के लिए सहमत हुए हैं। सबसे पहले मैं इन देशों के लीडर्स और वहां के नागरिकों को बहुत बहुत बधाई देता हूं। मुझे विश्वास है कि इन देशों के साथ मिलकर हम अपने सहयोग को एक नई गति और नई ऊर्जा देंगे। भारत के इन सभी देशों के साथ बहुत ही गहरे संबंध है, बहुत ही ऐतिहासिक संबंध है। ब्रिक्स की मदद से हमारे द्विपक्षीय सहयोग में नए आयाम अवश्य जुड़ेंगे।
So, viewers, Prime Minister of India actually making a very interesting point that the expansion of BRICS means that actually India's bilateral relations with the new members are also going to be strengthened, because we are not only going to be engaging with them one-on-one, which we always do as strategic partners, but also within the BRICS format now. Coming back to Ambassador Bhattacharyya, multilateral, bilateral, Ambassador, your entire career you have spent on both these things. The interwoven nature of these two came out, and what the Prime Minister was saying, and so it simply adds one more dimension in the way we engage bilaterally with each of these countries, isn't it, the new members. And I think it also helps us to create new alignments and new coalitions of like-minded countries within the BRICS framework. So, so rightly, like you said, nobody can hijack BRICS, and we will not allow it. So, in this context, how do you see this movement between bilateral and multilateral? And perhaps you served in West Asia, and if you look at three of the members, the new members are from that region. What do you think is going to happen to our main strategic partnerships as a result of the fact that we facilitated? I observed that President Ibrahim Raisi of Iran had a prior discussion with Prime Minister Modi before the expansion happened. So clearly we are coordinating closely with these countries, right? And it's good for our national interest, isn't it? And sometimes people, because the BRICS language is all about group and multilateral processes, and there are so many issues out there, but core national interests, ultimately India is pursuing that, isn't it, through BRICS?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. We've had outstanding relations with all these countries, and we are very happy that they are now part of the BRICS fraternity. And as Prime Minister mentioned, it helps not only in the broader global governance agenda that we have, but also in our bilateral relations. But I think the most crucial, important thing to recognize in this is that the multilateral world was in a state of flux. Many of the multilateral institutions were unable to deliver. Many of them had started with very good intentions, had done very good work, whether it's the UN or the Security Council or the World Bank and IMF. They'd done very good work at some point of time, but they became not as relevant as the contemporary realities were not fully reflected, and countries like us were not adequately represented in these organizations. So this democratization of the global governance structures that was necessary to reflect the multipolarity that has come about. Because today, through development, through technology, each country is much more able to be part of the globalized world. And particularly when you look at bigger countries like, the Saudis, the Iran, Egypt, UAE, the ones that have become members now, their role in the global system, whether it's in terms of looking at energy security, food security, or in terms of the financial structures, how we address climate change, all these will become more important. And the multipolarity aspect of this development is, I think, to my mind, the most significant. Of course, I'm sure that all these countries are also happy that they have now been invited to BRICS, and India has played a very key role in making sure that the expansion of BRICS is a systematic, orderly process based on criteria. This has been, I think, a singular role that India has played, and everyone recognizes this. And future developments in BRICS will also be guided by this foundation that India has played with these countries. So, India's role will be very, very deeply recognized.
And Ambassador Bhattacharya, there is also the category of partner countries that we are now talking about. The South African hosts at the Johannesburg summit were saying at least 22 countries had formally expressed interest or applied, quote unquote. So, only 6 out of the 22 have been admitted, but there are many more potentially who would want to join in. Now, that raises the question about the governance of BRICS. I mean, you have seen getting to yes among 5 itself is challenging, and it takes a lot of background work by diplomats before the top leaders come on and sign onto a piece of paper like a declaration or a joint communique. So now with 11 members and then potentially many more partner countries who may not have a vote but may have some powers and some say in the proceedings. One question is about the efficacy of BRICS. I mean, some people have been challenging. They're saying it's declining in importance, and especially because China has been, going on its unilateral path. Even though it's part of BRICS, it has other agendas. So, in that context, do you think this could be a liability? Could decision making slow down, and could it actually become, less efficient with more and more members coming in? I mean, G20, has 20 members, and then it has so many more outreach, partners as well. So, are we large group? Is it a challenge, you think?
So, I think there has not been enough information about what BRICS actually does, because the kind of concrete projects and activities that BRICS has engaged in across sectors is quite stupendous, particularly when you look at the economic sphere, the partnership for the future, when you look at the people-to-people exchanges. And these have been substantive exchanges and partnerships based on projects. The second element is that the NDB funds projects not only in BRICS countries, but in all other countries as well. In fact, the larger number of projects and the contributions are in countries outside
non-member countries. Yeah.
So, other countries have always been part of BRICS, and BRICS core members had realized that there was this great value that is available across in the developing world, in the global south, that needed to be tapped. And I think today what we have is, we have set the template for this deeper collaboration across sectors. I think what you said about the governance and decision making is a very apt one, and I think we need to understand this. And I suspect, though I don't know exactly what happened at the summit, I suspect what would have happened is that they had this gradation between full members and partners, so that people could be gradually co-opted into the process rather than abruptly, so that the processes and admin structures could also be worked in a gradual manner, which were also be in a sense endogenous. They must come from within. People must feel, countries must feel committed towards whatever they are doing. So, another point that has come out of the summit is that the efforts at consolidation of what we do on the agenda has again been put on the focus. In fact, just the para before the admission of new members, it talks about the consolidation efforts, and the Sherpas have again, the foreign ministers have been tasked to prepare a report before the next summit, because consolidation is extremely important. It is important for BRICS to focus on certain key areas that it has great competence in, and then have tangible results that people can see and feel, rather than spreading out too thin across the world. And in this, there is a combination of traditional as well as some of the new areas of growth, because after all, for BRICS, the big item on their agenda is really growth and development, inclusive growth and
economic pillar
development. And of course, the other one, which is to try and influence the governance structures globally. And in this, it is a little different from the G20. I see no competition with G7, which is another grouping, at which again, as you know, the G7 also has an extension program, and India has traditionally been a member of that, invited as one of the leading economies. Today, of course, we are the 5th largest, but the fastest growing major economy. So we've been participating in the G7 plus for a very long time. The G20 is a very interesting combination of both the developed as well as developing countries, of emerging countries, whereas BRICS is more of the South. Of course, you know, there are some countries that are very, very prosperous amongst them.
Or they have graduated out of the South, especially China, with a higher per capita income. And
I think Prime Minister also mentioned this in his remarks, that this is another opportunity for the Global South to raise its voice so that it is heard and there can be delivery on that.
Absolutely. Viewers, talking of Global South, India has consistently supported the cause of Africa and the African Union. As G20 chair, India has proposed a full membership, permanent membership for the African Union as a 21st member of G20. And even at BRICS, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been advocating to do more collectively for our sisters and brothers in Africa. And on this point, I have a brief video statement of our Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra talking about what India did in BRICS for Africa and what our aspirations are. This was a big theme of the Johannesburg summit. So let's hear from Vinay Quatra and continue the discussion.
The BRICS leaders are currently participating in the BRICS Africa outreach and the BRICS Plus dialogue, which 65 countries across Africa, Asia and Latin America. In his address today to the BRICS Africa outreach and to the BRICS Plus event, Honorable Prime Minister highlight what he is a very strong believer in, and he has led this right from the front, is what the BRICS brings on the table for the Global South, for the larger Global South. Honorable Prime Minister himself led the first Voice of Global South Summit ever earlier in January this year, ahead of substantive and intense engagement of G20 leadership beginning. And the whole idea was to really understand from the countries of the Global South as to what are their priorities, what are their concerns, what do they want from G20, which is of value to them. Yes, some of the countries of the Global South are a member of G20, but most of them are not. What are their developmental priorities? How do they see financing from the world for their developmental priorities across different areas? And that's, in a way, he sort of captured a very distilled sense of it in his remarks today. And he also emphasized, as he himself has been, that BRICS should also be a voice for Global South, for the larger Global South, not just for the priorities of the BRICS countries themselves. And he also stated what has always been one of the driving impulses of India's policy, which is a close partnership with Africa and to be a very strong, reliable, and a dependent partner of Africa's development journey.
So viewers, India's Foreign Secretary is saying that Africa is a key priority and a driving impulse of Indian foreign policy towards Global South is focused on Africa. Coming back to Ambassador Bhattacharyya, we bilaterally do a lot of things with individual countries in Africa, and of course we have been strengthening the hand of the African Union, their Agenda 2063 and all these and this time the BRICS summit highlighted the partnership with Africa. So many African leaders who are not members of BRICS were also invited to participate. How would you look at this element of the Africa outreach in particular, given that not all of them can become members? I mean, there are 55 countries and not all of them can be given full membership. Some may be partners, but some even otherwise are very central. And there had been a criticism of BRICS that, you know, it's like a power south as opposed to the global south, because the real south are least developed, less developed countries, and then this is the so-called middle layer below the rich countries. So hopefully we are working to bridge that gap between the so-called power south and the south south, and building the bridges. And I think a lot of African countries have expressed a lot of hope with India's advocacy of their cause as well. So your comments on the Africa part of BRICS and what we are doing there.
You know, when you go to Africa and you ask them what you think about India, the response is unequivocally and universally positive. And I think there are echoes of this that have come out in the document as well.
The BRICS declaration.
The joint declaration, where, you know, some of these more aggressive development assistance agendas, which actually just benefited the donor country, have not found mention. You know, there's a clear mention that we should be careful about that, and also debt servicing and so on. But I think what the Africa outreach reveals is that we are engaged with Africa at various platforms and forum, and we wish to see this as an integrated entity. Now, the India-Africa Summit that we host is another one example where it shows our deep commitment to the future of Africa. You know, it was started as just a few members and the African Union would have this summit, but then we expanded it to include every country in Africa.
Absolutely. So viewers, through BRICS and also individually, India has been championing the voice of the global south, and this has reflected in the Johannesburg summit outcome as well. The kind of engagements and initiatives that India has proposed continue to champion the weakest of countries in the international community and try to advocate for their for justice for them. And this is a key point, and that is why Indian leadership within BRICS is so strong and so solid and so widely accepted. It's not just that we are 1 out of 5. We are also doing significant things to bring so many other partners. So the expansion is not just the formal membership and new countries coming in, but the more looser kind of expansion of the Global South agenda that we hope to achieve through BRICS. So let's keep an eye on the BRICS expansion in a more holistic fashion. I want to thank Sanjay Bhattacharyya for sharing valuable insights. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So viewers, BRICS has grown. It may grow bigger in times to come, but India's stature within BRICS continues to rise and India becomes taller, and that is the most reassuring factor here. Let's follow the BRICS expansion from an Indian point of view and appreciate the work that our diplomacy is doing. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.